The desert morning was never meant to be quiet, yet that day its silence seemed sharper than any sound. A crack of gunfire ripped through the stillness, scattering birds into the pale sky, and with it came the rush of fate, heavy as the summer storm clouds that never quite reached the earth. Dust rose in a choking veil as Grace Jameson pressed her back to the splintered edge of a wagon, her breath trembling, her heart thundering with a rhythm that felt too fragile for a land so raw, so untamed. She had not come west to die, yet death stared at her from every shadow of the canyon trail, dressed in outlaw black and the smell of gunpowder. And still, even in the chaos, some hidden part of her soul whispered that destiny was about to draw near. It came in the shape of a horse's pounding hooves, the cut of sunlight glinting off steel, and the sudden shadow of a man who seemed carved out of the desert itself. He leapt from the saddle with a fluid grace, his revolver already finding its mark, and in the flare of fire and smoke, Grace caught her first glimpse of eyes storm-dark beneath the brim of a worn hat. He did not look at her as he fired, yet she felt his presence as though the earth itself had bent to shield her. A stranger, young, fierce, and impossibly certain in the midst of ruin. "Stay down," his voice carried, deep and steady, and in that command Grace felt an anchor, a healing thread weaving itself against her fear. Time twisted strangely then. Each heartbeat was both eternity and instant. Grace clutched her traveling bag like a talisman from another life, the polished edges of Boston refinement clashing with the grit and blood of Arizona territory. She should not have been here. She should have been standing before neat rows of children's desks, chalk dust soft against her skirts. Yet scandal had driven her west, shame had carved its hollow into her heart, and now the wilderness demanded that she live or perish with no in-between. Perhaps it was providence, perhaps folly, but she felt the wild begin to reach for her as surely as she reached for breath. When at last the final outlaw fled into the shimmering heat, the silence returned, not empty this time, but full, ringing with all that had not been said. The man holstered his revolver, and the sun caught him fully. His face was young, yes, younger than hers by near a decade, but marked by hardship and resolve. He extended his hand, and she, trembling yet unbroken, took it. The contact was brief, calloused strength meeting delicate fingers, yet it burned into her memory with the certainty of something she could never forget. "Thomas Ailey," he said, though his smile ghosted with boyish charm as he added, "Most folks call me Tucker." Her lips shaped her name, Grace Jameson, yet her voice felt small against the magnitude of what had just happened. She had been reborn in the shadow of a gunfight, and the first soul she saw upon opening her new life was his. The world seemed suddenly altered, colors sharper, sounds closer, even the heat pressing against her skin less suffocating. Tucker's eyes lingered on her, not with the careless glance of a passing cowboy, but with the gravity of someone who had already made an unspoken vow. That silent exchange told her what words could not, that this meeting was no accident. And so the journey began, with dust still settling, bodies strewn across the road, and a schoolteacher from Boston staring into the storm-lit gaze of a man who had no right to make her heart stir so suddenly, so violently. The road ahead was long, lined with danger and whispers of scandal left behind, but as he helped her into the saddle, his chest firm and warm against her back, Grace felt, for the first time in months, a flicker of healing, a fragile hope curling like a green shoot through the parched soil of her spirit. She did not know yet that this was the beginning of love. She only knew she had been spared, carried forward by fate, and that the story had only just begun. If these words stir something in you, if this beginning feels like the echo of a tale your heart longs to follow, then let your presence be known. Leave a trace of your thoughts, a like, a comment, a gentle subscribe. Each gesture is a lantern lit along the path, guiding this journey to continue, warming the storyteller's hands and reminding us all that even in the harshest desert, connection brings light. And now, with Grace pressed close to Tucker as the horse carried them toward an uncertain horizon, the next chapter of their lives and of this story was already rising like dawn. The sun beat mercilessly overhead as Tucker's horse carried them across the wild expanse, the world stretching in endless shades of copper and gold. Grace sat rigid at first, her hands clutched tightly around the leather of her bag, but the steady rhythm of hooves and the unshakable calm of the man behind her began to soothe the trembling in her chest. Each breath of desert air burned warm and dry, yet with every inhale she felt a little more alive, as though the dust itself carried something healing, stripping away the last fragments of Boston's suffocating whispers and replacing them with freedom. The trail was rough, the wilderness untamed, but in that very rawness she felt her own spirit loosen from the chains she had carried for too long. Tucker's presence was steady, his voice deep and unhurried whenever he spoke, a sound that seemed to settle the chaos of her thoughts. He told her of his youth, of Kentucky fields left behind, of loss too early, of the way the desert had become both punishment and home. Grace listened, her heart aching at the stark contrast to her own upbringing, sheltered in books and marble halls, where love had once promised permanence and then betrayed her with cruel indifference. She realized how little she had known of real struggle, how fragile her sorrows appeared beside his endurance. And yet, in the sharing of their truths, something warm bloomed between them, a recognition that pain wore different faces but left the same imprint on every soul. The land shifted slowly around them, cacti rising like sentinels, rocks jagged as old scars, and the sky a vast cathedral of unbroken blue. Grace stole glances at Tucker when she thought he would not notice. The strong line of his jaw, the quiet determination etched into his brow, the strange gentleness that surfaced when he passed her the canteen and cautioned her with a soft, small sips. Their fingers brushed, and the contact was slight, fleeting, yet her heart leapt as though the world itself had tilted. She told herself it was foolishness, the stirrings of gratitude twisted into something dangerous, but the truth lived in her pulse. She was drawn to him undeniably, like water to thirsty soil. At the stream they stopped, the horse lowering its head to drink, while Tucker lifted Grace down with hands that lingered just a moment too long at her waist. His touch was not careless. It was careful, grounding, as though he knew she might break if handled without tenderness. The heat of the day melted from her shoulders as cool water brushed against her skin, and she felt a quiet healing in the simple act of being cared for by someone who asked nothing in return. Tucker busied himself with his horse, yet Grace caught the curve of his smile when she sighed at the promise of a hot bath in the next town, a smile that softened the harshness of his features and hinted at a boy still alive beneath the man forged by hardship. They rode on, and the hours passed with silence that was not empty but full, filled with the cadence of hooves, the call of distant birds, the shared breath of two people learning the weight of each other's presence. Grace found herself speaking of her dreams, her father's lessons, her passion for teaching, and Tucker listened without interruption, his gaze forward, but his attention wholly hers. It had been so long since she had been truly heard, since her voice mattered not for what it promised society, but for what it revealed of her heart. That, too, was healing, a balm she had not known she craved until it was given freely. When at last the valley opened to reveal Rattlesnake Springs, humble and dusty against the sweep of the desert, Grace expected disappointment. Instead, she felt something stir, an odd fondness for the crooked buildings, the scattered homes, the lives lived with grit and resilience. Tucker guided her to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, and though Grace's legs wobbled as she dismounted, her spirit stood taller than it had in months. The welcome she received was warm, the promise of rest and shelter wrapped in kind words and steady hands, yet her gaze lingered on Tucker, who prepared to leave her there. She had no right to feel the pang of loss at his absence, but the ache was real all the same. That night, as steam rose from the copper tub and the scent of soap replaced the dust of the trail, Grace thought of his eyes, the way they caught the light like storms gathering over open plains, and she wondered if the desert had not only stripped her bare, but also begun to plant something new. Healing does not arrive in grand gestures, she reminded herself, but in moments small and quiet. The gift of water when parched, the laughter shared at the edge of exhaustion, the presence of a stranger who becomes less strange with every breath. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, only that the path she walked no longer felt like exile, but like the beginning of something unnamed, waiting just beyond the horizon. And so the days turned, drawing her deeper into the heart of a town that needed her and nearer to a man whose very existence unsettled and steadied her in equal measure. The stage of her life had shifted, and Grace Jameson, once a figure of whispers and broken promises, now stood at the threshold of a story she had never dared to imagine. The next morning, with the sun rising over the desert and Tucker's shadow returning to her doorstep, that story began to unfold, carrying her further into the warmth of belonging she had longed for, but never believed she would find. Morning light spilled gently through the lace curtains of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, carrying with it the scent of bacon and fresh bread. Grace stirred awake, disoriented for a fleeting moment, her mind reaching back to Boston before the low creak of wagon wheels and the call of a ranch hand outside reminded her where she truly was. Arizona was no dream. It was raw, alive, and changing her in ways she could not yet name. She rose, smoothed her dress, and pressed her palms against her cheeks as though she might steady the emotions that had stirred restless all through the night. Downstairs, the dining table was set simply, yet it carried the warmth of a home. Mrs. Henderson bustled about with kind efficiency, pressing a steaming cup of coffee into Grace's hands before she had fully settled. The older woman spoke of Tucker in that effortless way locals did, as if his name needed no introduction, as though he belonged to the very fabric of the town. Grace listened, her cheeks warming at every mention, though she tried to dismiss the sensation as gratitude and nothing more. Yet her heart betrayed her. Each beat quickened at the thought of him. Each glance toward the door carried the unspoken hope that he might appear again. Later, stepping outside into the soft golden haze, Grace wandered the main street of Rattlesnake Springs. Dust swirled at her skirts, but instead of disdain, she felt an odd tenderness for the simplicity around her. The wooden planks of the saloon porch, the scent of leather and hay drifting from the livery, the laughter of children darting past with bare feet kicking up earth. In Boston, everything had been polished to perfection, yet perfection had left her hollow. Here, in a town that bore its rough edges openly, she felt her spirit begin to heal. Imperfections became proof of endurance, and endurance was far more beautiful than polished facades. It was in front of the general store that she met Eliza Cooper and her young son. The boy's shy pride as he held up his book lit something within Grace, an echo of her truest calling. Kneeling before him, she encouraged his hesitant words, her own voice warm and melodic. In that moment, with dust rising and a child's eager eyes fixed on her, Grace remembered why she had crossed miles and heartbreak to begin again. Teaching was not simply her profession, it was her gift, the thread of healing she could weave into the lives around her. And here, in this tiny town forgotten by maps, she felt the pull to plant roots she had never expected to find. The day carried her to the livery, drawn by the metallic rhythm of hammer against iron. She found Tucker there, bent over a harness, his sleeves rolled, his frame lean and strong in the afternoon light. He looked up, surprise softening into a smile that seemed carved just for her. The air shifted when their eyes met, a quiet current humming between them. Grace spoke of Eliza's words, of the children in need of lessons, and Tucker, with his simple reasoning, reminded her there was no need to rush to Tucson. His logic was plain, but his gaze lingered long enough to suggest that his desire for her to stay stretched far beyond practicality. That evening she sat at her small desk in the boarding house, arranging notes and sketches for a makeshift classroom. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from a vitality she had thought long lost. Around her, the town had begun to stir with whispers of the new school, and in those whispers Grace heard welcome, purpose, and belonging. When she set down her pencil, the silence of the room carried her thoughts to Tucker once more. The image of his smile, the weight of his hand at her waist when he had lifted her from the horse, the storm in his eyes softened by kindness, all of it replayed until her breath caught with the realization that the boundary between gratitude and longing was vanishing swiftly. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the faint rustle of leaves. Grace leaned against the windowsill, gazing into the wide sky where stars began to kindle like lanterns. She whispered a prayer for courage, not for the dangers of the frontier, but for the tenderness growing within her, fragile yet fierce. Healing often came disguised, she thought, sometimes in a stranger's voice that steadied you when bullets flew, sometimes in the laughter of children who needed nothing but your time. And sometimes, perhaps, it came in the storm-colored eyes of a man whose presence had already begun to change the very rhythm of her days. By the time she turned from the window, her decision was forming like dawn. She would not flee forward to Tucson just yet. She would stay, if only for a while, to teach the children, to give the town what she could, and perhaps, though she dared not name it aloud, to see what story might unfold with Tucker Alley. The next morning promised new lessons, new bonds, and the fragile beginnings of something that felt far greater than she had imagined. And so the night closed around her gently, a cloak of desert quiet, carrying her softly toward the chapter that waited just beyond sunrise. Grace's first morning as a teacher in Rattlesnake Springs broke with a hush of promise, the sky painted in tender strokes of rose and gold, as if the desert itself wished to bless the day. She walked toward the Cooper homestead, her heart thrumming like the wings of a sparrow, her arms laden with slates and scraps of chalk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her gather. The front room had been swept and arranged, benches borrowed from the church lined in uneven rows, sunlight filtering across the rough floorboards as though eager to witness what would unfold. When the children arrived, some shyly clinging to their mother's skirts, others rushing in with bright laughter, Grace felt a stirring deeper than duty. She saw not just pupils before her, but souls hungry for knowledge, eager sparks waiting for flame. Her voice, steady though tender, filled the room as she introduced herself, spoke of letters and numbers, of the worlds hidden in books, of how every mind was a treasure waiting to be unlocked. The youngest watched with wide eyes, their fingers tracing the shapes she drew in chalk, while the older ones leaned forward with the kind of focus born from rarity. Education was a gift too seldom granted here. Grace guided them with patience, her words a healing rhythm, each lesson a bridge between their lives and the vastness of possibility. She divided them gently into groups, adjusting her teaching as though weaving a tapestry, careful that no thread was left loose. As hours passed, she forgot the heaviness she had carried from Boston, the whispers of betrayal, the loneliness of leaving everything familiar behind. All of it fell away in the glow of children's eyes as they stumbled through new words, laughed at mistakes, and clapped when one of them succeeded. When Eliza Cooper appeared at midday with bread and fruit, Grace realized she had not thought once of time. She had lived entirely within the present, her spirit nourished as surely as theirs. And through the open window she caught sight of a familiar figure on horseback, Tucker, pausing at a distance, his gaze fixed on the little schoolroom. He did not intrude, but the tilt of his hat was enough to assure her he was proud. The flutter in her chest reminded her of feelings she tried and failed to dismiss. When the children departed that afternoon, each carrying a scrap of knowledge like a jewel held close, Grace remained behind, tidying the chalk dust and rearranging benches. The quiet settled over her with the peace of a prayer answered. She had feared she might not belong anywhere again. That scandal had stripped her of purpose, but here she was, needed, welcomed, alive in ways she had not thought possible. As she gathered her things, a knock on the door startled her. Tucker stood there, hat in hand, a trace of dust still on his boots. His smile was not bold, but uncertain, as though he feared his presence might intrude upon her newfound sanctuary. She thanked him for coming, for watching over the day from afar, and he shrugged with that effortless grace of his, saying only that he wanted to be sure she had all she needed. Yet the way his eyes lingered told a different truth. They walked together along the creek, silence stretching between them, not as a barrier, but as a comfort. Grace found herself telling him of her father, of how he had believed education was the greatest gift, and Tucker listened as though every word mattered. In return, he shared a story of his own childhood, of the sister he had lost too soon, and in that sharing, a bond deeper than friendship began to weave itself. The sun dipped low, washing the desert in a palette of amber and crimson, and Tucker pointed out quail moving in the brush, a family staying close as night approached. Grace felt something shift within her, an ache that was not sorrow, but longing, for steadiness, for companionship, for the healing warmth of belonging to someone who saw her not as a scandal, nor as a teacher alone, but as a woman with a heart still capable of beating fiercely. When they parted at Mrs. Henderson's porch, Tucker's hand brushed hers in a fleeting touch, more promise than accident. Grace carried the memory of it upstairs with her, a pulse that stayed long after she had blown out the lamp. She told herself it was foolishness, that the gulf of years and the path she had chosen made such feelings impossible. Yet, as she lay in the quiet, listening to the soft wind through the desert night, she realized the truth. Healing had begun not only in the laughter of children, but also in the steady presence of the man who had saved her on a broken road. And though tomorrow held uncertainty, tonight held hope. With that hope, she closed her eyes, already dreaming of what the next dawn might bring. Evening settled over Rattlesnake Springs with the hush of a hymn, lanterns flickering in windows, the air scented with wood smoke and the faint perfume of desert blossoms that opened only after dusk. Grace sat at the small desk in her boarding room, her hands resting atop the day's lessons, though her thoughts wandered elsewhere. The classroom had been filled with eager eyes, laughter, and the rustle of chalk across slate. Yet what lingered most was the memory of Tucker at the doorway, his storm-colored gaze softened by something she dared not name. She had thanked him for nothing more than being near, but the gratitude that pulsed within her carried weight far heavier than courtesy. When Mrs. Henderson knocked softly to remind her of supper, Grace descended the stairs and found Tucker already waiting in the dining room. He had washed, his dark hair still damp, his vest neatly buttoned as though the evening demanded more care than the trail ever had. The sight stirred warmth through her chest, a quiet reminder that sometimes healing came not through solitude, but through the presence of someone who chose deliberately to share their time. They dined simply, beans, bread, tender beef, but the simplicity was woven with something deeper. Tucker listened to her stories of Boston with patient curiosity, never mocking the world so different from his own, while she listened to his tales of long rides and lonely camps as though hearing the heartbeat of the land itself. When the meal ended, Tucker hesitated, then asked if she might join him for a short walk. The evening air was cool, the stars flaring brighter with each passing moment, and Grace found herself drawn to the serenity of his company. They wandered beyond the edge of town, their steps carrying them to a low ridge where the desert unfurled beneath the silver wash of moonlight. There, Tucker spoke less of the land and more of himself, of mistakes made, of the weight of loneliness borne too young. His words were simple, unadorned, but their honesty wrapped around her like a gentle shawl. Grace answered in kind, her voice breaking only once when she confessed the betrayal that had driven her west. Instead of pity, Tucker offered quiet respect, his silence carrying more healing than 100 reassurances. The moment lingered, fragile and full, as though the night itself held its breath. Grace turned her face toward him, meaning only to thank him, yet her words faltered at the tenderness she found in his eyes. She looked away, chastising herself for such thoughts, but the warmth remained, echoing within her even as they made their way back to the boarding house. At the porch, Tucker paused, his hand hovering as though he wished to reach for hers, then settling instead against the brim of his hat. His good night was spoken softly, and Grace carried the timbre of it with her up the narrow staircase, her heart restless against the quiet walls of her room. Days unfolded in a rhythm that was both new and deeply comforting. Each morning, children filled the makeshift classroom, their voices bright with questions, their laughter spilling out into the dusty street. Each evening, Grace prepared lessons, her passion rekindled with every word she wrote on the slate. And often, in the spaces between, she saw Tucker, at the livery in the general store, pausing by the schoolhouse to watch the children at their studies. He never intruded, but his presence threaded through her days like a melody too sweet to ignore. The town noticed as well. Whispers followed her, soft and amused, yet not unkind. Grace tried to tell herself it was only gratitude, only friendship, but in the quiet of night, her heart told her otherwise. Saturday brought the town dance, and with it a current of anticipation that Grace could not quite shake. Mrs. Henderson insisted on helping her dress, smoothing the folds of her blue silk gown until it shimmered like twilight. When Tucker arrived to escort her, dressed in a clean black suit, the air seemed to still. His eyes, usually so steady, flickered with something unguarded at the sight of her, and in that gaze Grace felt both cherished and undone. The hall was lit with lanterns, the air alive with fiddle and laughter. Grace's steps faltered at first, uncertain in the swirl of strangers' eyes, but Tucker's hand at the small of her back steadied her. When he led her onto the floor for the waltz, she discovered to her surprise that he moved with grace, his palm warm against her waist, his breath brushing her cheek as he guided her through each turn. The world narrowed to the rhythm of the music and the strength of his embrace, and for those minutes there was no Boston, no scandal, no difference in years. Only two souls moving as though they had always belonged to one another. Later, when they slipped outside into the cool night, the music fading behind them, Grace dared to ask what had weighed on her heart. Whether his wish for her to stay was for the town's sake or his own. Tucker's answer was simple, stripped of all pretenses. Both. The honesty of it struck her like light breaking through storm clouds. She felt the pull of him then, undeniable and fierce, yet fear coiled tight in her chest. Duty, age, the life she had promised elsewhere, all pressed upon her with relentless hands. And still, when he leaned closer, his voice low and steady, confessing that she had become important to him, Grace felt something within her yield. That night, long after he had walked her back and left her with nothing more than the warmth of his words, Grace lay awake beneath the desert stars streaming through her window. Her heart trembled between caution and longing, but amid the tangle of fear, she felt the unmistakable stir of healing. For the first time since her world had shattered, she wanted again, wanted life, wanted love, wanted the chance to step into the unknown with someone whose presence had already begun to mend her spirit. As dawn crept soft and golden across the desert, Grace knew the story was shifting, carrying her toward a choice she could no longer ignore. Sunday morning dawned with a clarity that seemed to wash the desert in silver and gold, every cactus and stone outlined as if the world had been freshly painted. Grace walked to the small church on the edge of Rattlesnake Springs, her bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin, her heart curiously unsettled. The service was simple. Wooden benches, a plain pulpit, the voices of townsfolk rising in hymns that trembled with sincerity rather than polish, but it touched her in a way Boston's grand cathedrals never had. Here, faith was not an ornament of society, but a lifeline, and as she joined her voice to theirs, she felt the burden of her past grow lighter, as though each note carried a fragment of healing into the morning air. She knew Tucker was there, though he sat several rows behind her. She felt him, the way one feels the warmth of the sun, even with eyes closed. She resisted the urge to turn, to confirm what her heart already knew, and instead kept her focus on the sermon. The Reverend spoke of finding purpose in unexpected places, of how the wilderness often revealed paths we had never imagined. Grace's fingers tightened around her hymnal, for it seemed those words were meant for her alone. After the service, when townsfolk gathered in the dusty yard exchanging greetings and news, Tucker approached, his formality sharpened by the eyes of others. He greeted her as Miss Jameson, tipping his hat with a gravity that made her lips curve in a small smile. There was something steady in the way he offered his arm, and though propriety warned against such closeness, Grace placed her hand lightly upon it. They walked together beyond the cluster of townsfolk, their steps unhurried, their silence filled with all that could not be spoken aloud. Tucker led her along a quiet path fringed with cottonwoods until they came to a small clearing overlooking the valley. The breeze carried the scent of sage and damp earth from the previous night's rain. He told her the town council had met that very morning and chosen this spot for a future schoolhouse. Grace looked around, her imagination already filling the space with children's laughter, slates tapping, voices reciting lessons. The thought brought an ache so tender it was almost pain, for she saw clearly what her heart longed for, even as her mind clung to her promise in Tucson. Tucker did not press her. He simply watched her face, letting her drink in the vision. His patience, his quiet strength, felt like another kind of teaching, showing her that love need not demand, that healing could come in the form of freedom rather than chains. She thanked him softly, her voice touched with sincerity, and he only nodded, offering his arm again, as though the moment required no grand words, only trust. That evening, as twilight draped itself over the desert, Grace found a small bouquet of wildflowers resting on her schoolroom desk. A note was tucked among the stems. "For the best teacher Rattlesnake Springs has ever known." The simple gesture drew tears to her eyes. She had thought herself forgotten, cast aside by society, yet here she was, honored in a way that reached beyond pride into the marrow of her being. When Tucker appeared later at the boarding house, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper, her breath caught. Inside was a leather-bound book of Wordsworth, its pages marked where he had underlined lines about light, grace, and strength. She read them aloud on the porch as the stars bloomed overhead, her voice trembling with the beauty of the poetry and with the knowledge that his gift was more than paper and ink. It was understanding, remembrance, the promise that someone truly saw her. When she finished, Tucker's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "That's how I feel about you." "I couldn't say it in words like that, but it's the truth." Grace felt her heart lurch, a painful, exquisite ache that was both fear and longing. She wanted to retreat into reason, to remind him of years and obligations, but his sincerity cut through all pretense. He was not asking for promises, only offering his heart with the unembellished honesty of a man who had nothing to hide. The night held its breath as he admitted quietly, "I'm falling in love with you." The words seemed to settle over her like a blessing and a burden all at once. She whispered that she was afraid of mistakes, of trusting too soon, of age becoming a barrier. Tucker's hand found hers, warm and steady, his thumb tracing small circles across her skin. "I can't promise life will be easy," he said, "but I can promise I won't run. Age doesn't change the truth of what I see when I look at you." His voice, roughened by trail dust and sincerity, carried more healing than any polished vow could have. Grace closed the book, her pulse wild, and for a long time neither spoke. The desert night enfolded them, cicadas singing, stars wheeling overhead, as though marking the beginning of a story neither of them had sought, but both had found. She felt the world narrowing to the space between them, the warmth of his hand, the stormlight in his eyes. And though doubt still stirred like shadows at the edge of her thoughts, she knew with startling clarity that her heart had already chosen. By the time Tucker rose to leave, tipping his hat once more, Grace's world was no longer what it had been. She sat alone on the porch, the book of poetry resting in her lap, her spirit trembling with fear and hope entwined. Healing, she realized, was not always gentle. It was sometimes a jolt, a lightning strike, a truth spoken aloud beneath a canopy of stars. And as she carried the memory of his words with her into sleep, Grace knew the days ahead would demand a decision, one that would shape not only her own life, but his as well. The next morning would bring children to her classroom, townsfolk to her door, and the steady rhythm of desert life. But beneath it all ran the undercurrent of something more powerful, a current drawing her inexorably toward a choice she could no longer postpone. And with that quiet certainty, the story moved forward, deeper into the space where love and destiny waited to entwine. Rain fell in a steady hush on Friday morning, rare and welcome in the thirsty desert, pattering against rooftops and softening the dust-choked streets. Grace stood before her students in the Cooper home, the little room filled with the smell of damp earth and the rustle of children's excitement at the storm. The rhythm of the rain seemed to guide her lesson, her voice steady and warm, a melody of encouragement. For hours she forgot everything else, her past in Boston, her fears of the future, and lived only in the glow of eager eyes, the joy of words taking root in young minds. Yet when the door opened and Tucker stepped inside, rainwater dripping from his hat, the children's cries of greeting filled the air, and Grace felt the ground shift beneath her. He waited until the lesson ended, his gaze steady, his presence filling the room with quiet certainty. When the last child departed, he approached her, removing his hat, his voice softer than the rain. "I was hoping my invitation still stood for the dance tomorrow." Grace's heart fluttered at the simplicity of his words. She nodded, unable to keep the warmth from her voice. "It does." In that moment, the world outside, the rain, the distance, the obligations she clung to, melted away, leaving only the truth that she wanted to be near him, whatever wisdom or fear might say otherwise. Saturday arrived, clear and crisp, the desert washed clean beneath a sky of unbroken blue. Grace, prepared with trembling hands, smoothing the folds of her one fine gown, the blue silk she had once thought she might wear in Boston society. Mrs. Henderson pinned her hair with practiced fingers, murmuring that she looked beautiful. Grace hardly recognized her reflection. The woman in the glass carried both sorrow and resilience, a quiet strength that had been forged in heartbreak and was now softened by hope. When Tucker arrived, dressed in a black suit that sharpened every line of his frame, his eyes lingered on her with reverence. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice roughened by honesty. Grace felt her cheeks flush, the warmth spreading like healing through the chambers of her heart. The town hall glowed with lantern light, music filling the space with fiddle and laughter. Grace hesitated at the threshold, self-conscious beneath so many curious gazes, but Tucker's hand at the small of her back steadied her. Together, they stepped inside, and whispers rippled through the crowd, soft, knowing, approving. When Tucker led her onto the floor, the first notes of a waltz rose, and she followed his steps, uncertain at first, then guided effortlessly by his steady hand. His palm against her waist was warm, his breath brushed her cheek, and with each turn the world narrowed until nothing remained but his presence, the strength of his hold, the storm and safety mingled in his gaze. They danced again and again, laughter mingling with music, the space between them shrinking until every glance carried a promise neither dared yet to name. Between dances, townsfolk stopped them with words of gratitude for Grace's teaching, and Tucker stood proudly at her side, his silence speaking volumes. When at last they slipped outside into the cool night, the stars overhead sharp as silver, Grace turned to him with a question trembling on her lips. "Is it only for the children you want me to stay? Or is it something more?" Tucker met her eyes, his own stripped bare of pretense. "Both," he said simply. The word carried the weight of truth, no ornament, no disguise. Grace felt her breath catch, the ache of longing and fear twining inside her. She tried to remind herself of duty, of contracts waiting in Tucson, of years separating them, yet his presence dissolved every argument. He stepped closer, his voice low, a confession carried like prayer. "You've become important to me. When I'm with you, I feel settled in a way I never have before." Her heart surged with a dangerous tenderness, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I feel something too." The night seemed to hold them then, the music drifting faint from the hall, the air alive with possibility. Tucker lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss there so gentle it seared into her soul. 3 days, he said, his eyes searching hers. "The stage leaves Wednesday. 3 days to show you what's worth staying for. If I fail, you'll go with my blessing, but I can't let you leave without trying." The desert wind stirred around them, cool and fragrant with sage, wrapping their silence in promise. Grace stood trembling between fear and longing, her hand still burning where his lips had touched. Healing, she thought, came sometimes in the risk of choosing, in the willingness to step into uncertainty with another soul beside you. And though doubt lingered, she knew the truth. Her heart was already leaning toward him, toward this place, toward the life she had never dared to imagine, but now could not bear to lose. When they returned inside, the dance continued, laughter and music spilling into the night. But Grace no longer felt like a stranger among them. She was part of this story now, woven into its fabric by the children's eager voices, by Mrs. Henderson's quiet wisdom, and by the steady, unyielding presence of Tucker Ali. And as the final song faded, and he walked her home beneath the silver wash of stars, Grace knew her decision was no longer a distant worry. It was a living flame, burning brighter with each step, carrying her inexorably toward the moment when choice would no longer be delayed. Dawn rose pale and soft on the morning Grace was meant to leave. The stagecoach rattled into town, wheels crunching over damp earth still fresh from the rain, the driver calling out with a voice as rough as the desert wind. Grace stood on the boarding-house porch, her bag clasped tightly in her hands, her heart weighted by the goodbyes she had already spoken. Children clung to her skirts one last time, pressing small gifts into her palms. A wildflower, a pebble smoothed by the creek, a drawing of their classroom where she stood impossibly tall and crowned with a halo of chalk dust. Their faces blurred through her tears, every farewell both healing and breaking her in the same breath. She told herself she must be strong, that duty called her to Tucson, but every step toward that coach felt like walking away from the very life her soul had begun to crave. The driver lifted her trunk with practiced ease, and Sheriff Bailey offered his arm to guide her up. The entire town had gathered, faces lined with gratitude, voices offering blessings and thanks. Yet, through it all, Grace searched for one face, one presence she had not seen since the evening of the dance. Tucker had said he would not come, that perhaps it was better for both of them, and though her reason agreed, her heart throbbed with disappointment, sharp as any wound. She settled inside the coach, the door closing with a hollow finality, and as the horses lurched forward, she leaned out the window, watching the faces of her students and their parents fade into the wide desert horizon. The coach had travelled only a few miles when dust stirred on the road behind them. Grace's breath caught as she recognized the silhouette, the rider pressing hard against the earth, horse and man moving as one. Even before she could see his features, she knew Tucker. The driver grumbled at her plea, but brought the stage to a halt, and Grace was out the door before the wheels had fully stilled. Tucker dismounted in a whirl of dust, his hat askew, his eyes blazing with something rawer than she had ever seen in him. For a long moment they simply stared, the silence carrying every unspoken word of the days they had shared. "I thought you weren't coming," she whispered, her voice trembling like the fragile strings of a violin. "I wasn't," he admitted, his breath uneven, "but then I realized I'd regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't try one last time." His words fell plain, stripped of polish, and yet in their very roughness lay their truth. "I love you, Grace. I know it's fast, and maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's real. Stay. Not for duty, not for obligation. Stay, because this place, these people, and maybe even I, could be what you've been searching for." Her heart thundered. Fear pressed in, reminding her of years between them, of contracts signed, of society's whispers that still clung like shadows. Yet as she looked into his eyes, storm-dark and unflinching, she felt all of it dissolve. He reached for her hands, holding them as though they were precious glass. "I'm not asking you to give up teaching," he said, his voice rough but steady. "That schoolhouse will be built, and it needs you. I'm asking you to take a chance, on this town, on me, on us." Tears burned her eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "So am I," Tucker whispered. "But some things are worth being afraid for." The world seemed to still around them, the desert stretching wide and eternal, the driver impatiently tapping his pocket watch, the horses shifting restlessly. Grace felt her life balancing on the edge of a choice, between safety and surrender, between obligation and love. She heard again her father's voice, telling her that education was the greatest gift, but now she knew another truth. Love, too, was a teacher, and sometimes it asked the bravest lessons of all. She let out a trembling breath, lifted her gaze to Tucker's, and whispered the words that freed her heart at last. "I'm staying." The driver muttered, unloading her trunk with a shake of his head, but Grace barely heard him. Tucker's arms closed around her, lifting her from the earth in a fierce, unrestrained embrace, spinning her until laughter broke free from her lips like music. The desert sky blazed above them, a vast canvas of promise, and Grace felt, for the first time since Boston's betrayal, wholly alive. Healing had found her, not in running from the past, but in choosing the path her heart had already begun to walk. They returned to Rattlesnake Springs side by side, the horse carrying them back as if it knew the way by heart. The town, surprised at her reappearance, broke into smiles and cheers. Mrs. Henderson folding her into a knowing embrace, Eliza pressing her hand with quiet joy, the children shouting her name as though she had never truly left. Tucker stood close beside her, his arm brushing hers, his smile radiant with the certainty of a man who had risked his heart and been met with grace. That night, under the soft desert stars, Grace leaned into Tucker on the porch swing, her voice low but certain. "I love you." The words came easily now, unburdened by fear. He kissed her gently, answering with the promise she had longed to hear. "And I love you, age and all. We'll make the best of it." The world faded to silence, broken only by the healing rhythm of their breathing, two lives weaving into one. Years would follow. Weddings, laughter, the birth of children, the building of the schoolhouse that rang with voices brighter than the desert sun. Grace would look back on that morning when the stagecoach stopped on the open road and know with absolute certainty that she had chosen not just love, but life. And in the tender strength of Tucker's embrace, she would forever find her home. If this story has stirred your heart, if it has brought even a small measure of healing or warmth to your day, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is a lantern in this circle of stories. Like, subscribe, and stay with us, so together we can keep weaving tales that remind us of love's courage, the beauty of second chances, and the healing power of hope.